Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dia de Portugal, Dia de Camões, Dia das Comunidades Portuguesas. Indeed, today is Portugal Day and June 10th of 2022. Want to welcome each and every one of you as we, through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno, give you a brief, very brief outlook, of course, about the Portuguese American presence, but mostly we want to talk about, of course, this day, Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades Portuguesas, by giving you a very brief historical outlook about the day, how it began, what it means in the Portuguese idiosyncrasy, and a little bit about its historical context. We talk a lot about Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades Portuguesas. We talk a lot about what it is and what it isn't, what it represents, what doesn't it represent, but we don't really talk a whole lot about how Dia de Portugal began and a little bit about what its significance is within, of course, Portugal. It is the National Day of Portugal, but all days, such as our 4th of July, have a history, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it is Dia de Portugal, it is Dia de Camões, it is, of course, Dia das Comunidades Portuguesas, and we'll talk a little bit about all three of those aspects. But because it is, of course, we want to start with the national anthem, and it's a national anthem actually recorded at a time of a pandemic. We are just on the outset of it. Although there are still staggering numbers out there, as we all know. And it is what we're going to share with you was an interpretation by Portugal's fadista, one of Portugal's awesome fadistas, young fadistas, Ana Moura. So let's take a look and let's listen to the Portuguese national anthem, o hino nacional, a portuguesa.
Heróis do mar, nobre povo, nação valente e imortal, levantei hoje de novo o esplendor de Portugal. Entre as brumas da memória, ó Pátria, sente-se a voz dos teus egrégios avós, que há de guiar-te à vitória, às armas, sobre a terra, sobre o mar, às armas, pela pátria lutar, contra os canhões marchar, marchar.
And so that was the voice of Ana Moura as a way to begin this presentation, a very brief one, as I said. Once again, welcome on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University, Fresno, on this 10th of June, Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades Portuguesas. So how did this holiday begin? A very brief synopsis presentation of it. It actually began of course, it's in honor of, first and foremost, of Luís Vaz de Camões, which is Portugal's premier poet, and whose death is June 10th of 1580. That's the best date that we have. There are some discrepancies according to some historians, but that is the official death that we have of Luís Vaz de Camões, who is, as I said, Portugal's premier poet, and among other things, is the author of Os Lusíadas, which is Portugal's epic poem, and that really solidified the Portuguese idiosyncrasy. He wrote many other sonnets, many other poems. Luís Vaz de Camões, that's who we are commemorating. And that's, as I say to students, it is kind of cool or totally cool that we commemorate the day of a poet and that we dedicate the Dia de Portugal. Many times these days, these nationalistic holidays have a bit to do with a battle, have a bit to do with, in our case here in the US, of course, the Declaration of Independence. And they usually have, but in lots of different countries, it's a battle, a freedom battle, some an issue in that aspect. And this is a interesting take on it. That Portugal chose the dates that we know as best as the date that Luís Vaz de Camões passed, June the 10th of 1580, which, by the way, is around the time or the year that Portugal unfortunately lost its independence for a long time, for 60 years, between 1580 and 1640. So when did Dia de Portugal begin as we know it today? How was it established? So it was actually first a municipal holiday in the municipality of Lisbon, Lisbon being, of course, as most of you know, the capital of Portugal. So those who were in favor of changing the political system in Portugal in the 19th century came to the streets of Lisbon during the kingdom of Louis the First. He was the king of Portugal when this happened, and it was basically an event trying to gather up as much support as possible to change Portugal from a monarchy to a republic. And so it was after that that the city of Lisbon decreed a municipal holiday. And then it was decreed, I should say, by the First Republic as a municipal holiday. It only became a national holiday in Portugal much later. It was done through the dictator Antonio Oliveira Salazar during his reign, and he was a dictator. Between him and Marcelo Caetano, Portugal lived a very brutal dictatorship for almost a half a century. And it was basically Salazar who took it from a municipal holiday to a national holiday and actually called it the Day, of course, of Portugal, Dia de Camões. It didn't have the other aspect of the Portuguese community. He actually called it O Dia da Raça, or the Day of the Race, as if the Portuguese were a race. But it was his way. He used this holiday. He used this holiday to promote his very nationalistic spirit, and he used this holiday to promote the presence and the continuing presence, even though the United Nations had voted against it, but the continuing presence of Portugal in its overseas colonies, mainly in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, but mainly in Africa. And so Antonio Oliveira Salazar used this as a propaganda tool. So it was decreed a national holiday by him, by his government, by the so-called Estado Novo, new state, and he used it very much as a political and a propaganda tool to entice in the Portuguese this sense of imperialism, this sense of right that we supposedly had to an imperialistic state when it was no longer something that happened throughout Europe. But then it changed. It changed, of course, with the April 25th revolution of 1974, a holiday that unfortunately we in the Portuguese American communities do not celebrate as much. And I have said there before, I don't understand why. There are reasons, and I've done a bit of research in that aspect. However, the 25 de Abril of 1974 brought democracy to Portugal. We're coming upon the 50th anniversary in just a couple of years. And of course, with the 25 de Abril, there was a process called the 3 Ds in Portugal, the 3 Ds, os 3 Ds. And it was, first of all, number one, to democratize the country. Number two, to decolonize. So no more colonies, no more of this imperialistic behavior. And number three, to develop the country. So os 3 Ds, the 3 Ds were a process that was talked about right after the revolution of 1974, April 25th. Democratizar, descolonizar, desenvolver. So to democratize, to decolonize, and to develop. And so the vision of Salazar and how and why he began the 10th of June kind of was left behind to the history books. Unfortunately, some areas throughout the world, including in communities in the U.S. and other parts of the world, there's a bit more of the nationalistic aspect than there is of the new spirit of the 3 Ds: democratizar, descolonizar e desenvolver. And so in 1978, the day took on a new meaning to be Dia de Portugal, Day of Portugal, Dia de Camões, the Day of the Poet, and Dia das Comunidades Portuguesas. So to bring in the Portuguese communities as part of this. So there's no longer about colonization. It is about the Portuguese presence in the world through the spirit of the Portuguese communities, such as the rich and very strong Portuguese American community throughout the state of California, and certainly in the central San Joaquin Valley and throughout the entire valley as well, and throughout the United States in many, many different states, but of course the New England states, of course the tri-state of New York and tri-state region of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, down a bit further in Virginia and the Carolinas and Florida, and of course here California and parts of the West Coast, Hawaii, etc. So since 1978, this holiday has also been known as Dias das Comunidades Portuguesas. Some folks in the Portuguese American community, I myself, a bit of editorializing, but it's the truth, and I've written extensively about this. I myself feel it should be Dia da Diaspora. We have a Portuguese diaspora, and one day we'll take some time here through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute and talk to you a little bit about that concept. Actually, bring a few folks that have done a lot of work in diaspora studies to talk a little bit about what is a diaspora and why the Portuguese, certainly in the Americas, in the North American continent, we are a diaspora, and other parts of the world as well. So, bit of history there about the Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades Portuguesas. It is today. It is June 10th. And that is basically the reason why it is being commemorated in many parts of the North America diaspora, the United States and Canada. It's usually a day or around the day, if not today, of course. There is also always around the weekend. For those of you who are not familiar with the Portuguese American community, these commemorations are usually either the weekend after the Dia de Portugal, the 10th of June, or the weekend before. For example, here in California, it's been a mixture of different things, but there is a parade in Kelly Park in San Jose as one of the many events, and that is this Saturday, the 11th. There are parades through the East Coast, throughout other parts. In the Portuguese American communities in Central California and throughout California, all the way from San Diego to Arcata, the holiday, the Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades Portuguesas, doesn't have the same tonality that it has in some parts of the East Coast. And the main reason that have been involved in the Portuguese American community have been discussing this for a few decades is because Dia de Portugal most of the time falls around the Holy Ghost festas, as festas do Espírito Santo, and to those who are of Azorean ancestry in California, the Espírito Santo speaks a bit higher than a nationalistic holiday, than the holiday of a nation. So it is there were festas. There were from what we've gathered, there were at least 14 festas last weekend, and there's again another 10 to 12 festas this weekend. So there's a lot of different events going on. But every time there is a Festa do Espírito Santo, there's a celebration also of Portugal because the flag is there, because the national anthem is played, along, of course, with the Star Spangled Banner. So just because there isn't a parade dedicated to Dia de Portugal actually, 14 different cities last weekend and 12 different cities this weekend is being celebrated throughout the Holy Ghost festas throughout the state of California. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Happy Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das comunidades ou da diáspora portuguesa. Take care, everyone.